like, okay, let's go with that premise.
Okay, so
then
then
you go, well, what would be the reason for making it? And you go, love.
okay, so no. Okay, so then let's go with the idea that there is a God, right? Let's go with that idea, right? Now,
For now.
okay, for now, sure. So now, why would the God make himself so elusive that you as an individual have to put so much faith in believing that he exists?
Well, he doesn't have to make himself so invisible, right, that we, right, are forced to love him. Now, if he was all present, right, and we were unable to even think that God doesn't exist, well, then there would be no choice to love him. And in fact, we wouldn't have to love him. We just have to accept the truth of it, right?
Okay. Okay, so he's an all-knowing God
Right.
and knows all of this.
But that's not the reason, right? That's just a fact of if God was doing it, right, to make us love him, right? But he doesn't make us love him.
But he doesn't
But
make
if
him.
you're asking
Okay.
why would in this created universe would
Okay,
he be separate from it?
I think you're missing
right?
I think you're missing my point of view. I'm saying like he doesn't make himself known to the individual.
Yeah, he reveals himself. To the individual each time.
How does he do this? This is what I'm asking. How does he do this?
How does he reveal himself?
Yes.
As a Christian, how do I understand he revealed himself through the breathed word?
Yeah.
That was in the Old Testament and the New, and is present with us in the Spirit. So you don't want to go into the history or you just want to go a lived experience of God. Like I walk down the street and I'm like, boom, God, like.
That's why I want you to separate that with what I'm talking about. Because if you're going to say you're falling back on the information that's been provided to you, you're just running on a concept that's been taught to you, which is that shared knowledge and all that kind of crap.
Well, it's exactly what you do with climate change. You know?
Pardon?
But you're just relying on the information that's been given to you. You know, and that's what you rely on in climate change.
Wait one second. Wait,
sufficient.
Wait.
Anyway.
Back it up for 1 second. Do you think that climate change is just stuff that's being told to us?
Well, it is, isn't it? The idea of climate change, right, is an idea that is taught, right? I mean, we obviously all look outside and go, I know climate changes, and they're like, no, that's weather. You're like, with climate, what are you talking about? We're talking about global effects, right? That can only be seen in totality. You can't stick your head out the window and go, I am sensing climate change, because you won't. Or you go, I'm sensing global warming when Texas is freezing over. You're like, no.
You're saying that climate change is real or not in the conversation that we were having?
Climate change is, very real. Climate changes all the time. Climate change is a very real thing. Without humans or with humans, climate will change. And there's a whole science behind how and why it changes.
Okay.
100% true.
So do you think we've accelerated it to the point that the system is going to break, or no?
We don't know what breaks the system, since we've had
pouring a bunch of carbon dioxide into the system.
Yeah.
That breaks.
Well, we've had now the carbon dioxide now is 10 times lower than it was further back in history. So that we don't know what is like death levels of carbon dioxide.
You're comparing to when? To the beginning of the planet, or are you talking about?
This would be multiple millions of years, hundreds of millions of years ago, when there was accounts of, when you're talking about the Jurassic period, right, where the atmosphere, this is why you'd have dragonflies that had 6 feet wingspans, right, because the atmosphere was literally 2 to 3 times thicker than it was now, right, and the composition was not the same, and the composition of the atmosphere has changed a lot, right, in degrees of what we have seen in the last sort of 2 to 3 million years, right? Like way back then, it was like a different world, much thicker atmosphere, much higher levels of CO2, We've had times when the CO2
I don't think
has
it
gone
was higher
right
levels
down.
of CO2. It was much more like higher levels of oxygen. So
No. It was high. No, if we had much higher levels of oxygen, our atmosphere would ignite. So we definitely know how oxygen cannot get so high, right? Literally because fires would ignite and they quickly burn up all that oxygen. So literally, the fires on the world and everything have maintained a standard level of oxygen because oxygen is so combustible that if that went up much higher, it would just burn itself out, and any fire would just quickly burn it up. So that's how that sorts itself out. But yeah, CO2, we've had levels of 4,000, 6,000 parts per million. We're now in about parts 400. If that science that accounts those levels is reliable, then that is the account.
I have to apologize, but I've never heard of the CO2 being higher than what I understand it to be right now. And the only time I'm assuming that it could have been that high is when the plant was first being created and the atmosphere and all the volcanoes and all the eruptions and all that kind of stuff were creating that kind of intensity in carbon dioxide in the oxygen.
It swung up and down. Yeah, it swung really down and really up. Yeah, like before.
Okay, so,
obviously, you're 100% right. When there was no when it was mostly CO2 and methane and other stuff before photosynthetic bacteria happened, which was a few billion years ago, whatever it was.
Okay.
3, when we had the snowball Earth, right? And it seemed after the snowball Earth, right? Because that seemed to be potentially, we don't know for sure, but if we're going to go with logos and logic and reasoning, that when algae, right, evolved, when we suddenly had photosynthetic bacterium organisms that lived inside another organism, right? So we had this original what do you call it? Symbiosis, right? That this suddenly started chundering through all the CO2 to make its sugars, right? And it was suddenly a new life. Then it probably did take a lot of the CO2 out of the atmosphere and bring on potentially a freezing of the Earth, killing out millions of, which of course catastrophic, extinctions of most life.
Okay, but
so that's way back then. But since then, yeah, it's gone up and down and up.
Okay,
and down.
So
yeah,
just to pause you for 1 second there. You do understand those kinds of changes happens over hundreds of millions of years, right?
It depends. Some of the freezes, some of the big drops have happened very quickly, right? Very quickly, like within a couple of years. Yeah. So the freezes, the increases in temperatures usually bring about very controlled, graduative changes. But even as an example of the woolly mammoths up in Siberia, there was ones that were caught in the last ice age that are now freezing because, yes, it is getting warmer and, yes, ice does retreat. That when they found them, they found in their stomach the fresh food that they had eaten. And this was a group of woolly mammoths, maybe 8 or 12 or something, because, they hang around in gangs. And they all died in the same place. They were all seemingly facing the same way. This is often when huge and hard weather comes. You'll often see cows do it as well. They all face the same way, face into the weather.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to be that this weather came in, right, out of nowhere, and the food that was in their stomach had not even been digested. They predict for a body mass of theirs to have been frozen, that they would have gone down into the -40s and then not gone back up. Like these animals ate, died, and were almost fast frozen. That's their only explanation for how it happened. So this wasn't saying which. This is scientists, right? Who said the way that we can explain this phenomenon, not say it's impossible, is that it's not the only case where we have found areas that have suddenly dropped into freezing temperatures, right, and then not come out of them for hundreds of thousands of years. But the actual process of getting cold very quickly and a very quick drop seems to be present in areas of the world. Doesn't happen globally,
So
obviously, when
okay, so I live in Canada, and I believe in the 90s we were hit with a flash freeze where we had an ice storm that froze over pretty much everything, right? Those are rare
yeah.
occurrences that kind of happen. But the likelihood for the mammoths, due to the fact they already live in a climate that's already cold, the probability of them dying altogether like that is that it's potential that whatever ice base that they were on, they could have easily fallen into the water, or there was a crack or something for them to
No,
just flash freeze.
remember, it was like 10, 12 of them just on a flat plane all together that died there, right? And they all died together in that moment, and they only became unfrosted, tens of thousands of years later. So yeah, they're up north. It gives you an example that these huge glacial freezes can happen, and then they don't come back for tens of thousands of years. Again, perfectly in line with what you're saying. Again, these things are on geological terms, Rob, and I'm with you 100%.
Okay.
But that's just an example, right? That goes, well, if it's true in that, right, then obviously when we talk about climate change, pre-man climate change, we have very dramatic climate changes, right? And it happens over billions of years, of course, and there are these big changes, right, that do happen over millions of years. But even within those millions of years, it's not all graduated. Even within those millions of years, you can have huge drops and lifts, right? And this seems to be what we have to understand about the nature of this planet. We don't know what breaks this planet. It's such an extreme environment, seemingly, but seems to be able to maintain life, whatever the extremes, whether it's super hot, super cold, for us, not compared to other planetary bodies, obviously. So in the sense, when we go, so humans adding their CO2, will it have an effect? And you go, well, everything has an effect. And you're going, but anything like what nature has done? And you're like, well, I hope not. I hope we're not as bad as nature can be. But in this set of this amount of CO2 is going to cause the collapse of the ecological system. You're like, no. Is it going to collapse the end of the world or humanity? You're like, no. Is it would it mean an inefficient and massively overproductive and artificial Western capitalist system would survive a mini ice age? You're like, no. Systems of civilization will not survive catastrophic climate change, but humans will be fine, animals will be fine, life on this earth, Gaia, will be fine, in those terms. We're not in an existential threat.
In a way, it seems like you're saying that it doesn't matter the amount of people who die and how many species we wipe out in the process. As long as the planet is here and some form of life continues to live, that's okay with you. It seems like that's what you're saying.
No. Well, no, I would be saying it doesn't matter if I'm okay with it or not, right? My fifis, right, are not not in the equation of how to look at this, right? You're looking at nature, looking at what does cause it to catastrophically change, right? We don't seem to be in that position right now. A lot of the signs are that we are looking historically, if we're keeping the rhythm, of going back into a much colder period, right? So that would be the biggest danger. Now, if our CO2 is helping to keep that level, that would be good, but nature's not that simple, life's not that simple. If the added amount is going to destabilize that system, then what are we looking at? Are we looking at the 0.00003%? Is something like that. It's 10 of added CO2 compared to the normal annual cycle of CO2 on the Earth could tip something out of the balance. Then it seems, well, nature by itself has already been on a warming trend and maintaining this warming trend. If humans are accelerating it, I would say, myself personally, the biggest fear would be that it could tip us into a new ice age, not the opposite. And there's plenty of climate scientists that say that would be a possibility, but they don't know how to model that in. What you're going down to, which is what I completely agree with, but it's gone off the charts now in sensible conversations, is mankind responsible for the world around him? And I say yes. Do we have to have a good relationship with the world around us? And you're like, yes. But is CO2 production the greatest evil that we're doing to nature? And I don't think it is. And I don't think we're looking at this existential crisis of CO2 production bringing the end of the world in. I don't think it's realistic.
So wait, you do understand that CO2 captures heat and retains heat and all that kind of stuff, right? That's the reason why the planet is warming up, right?
Thank God that it does. Otherwise, we'd just be a block of ice. Thank God that it does. Yeah.
What? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Without the insulating powers of CO2, although CO2 is not the most insulating gas in the atmosphere, of course we know that by far, like 90% water, right? But CO2 is certainly a major aspect of that blanket that we have around the Earth, keeping the sun's energy in.
Okay, so I want to like touch on this again simply, and then we'll go back to the whole religion thing. Okay, so if CO2 in the atmosphere captures and retains heat, causing a greenhouse effect, which warms the planet, like you're saying it does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this in turn has effect on the rest of the planet.
Everything's connected.
We'll view it as this as simply as possible, right? There's a chain reaction to every action to some extent, right?
Positive feedback loops, you want to call it, yeah.
Okay.
Positive feedback loops.
I just need to understand a little bit of how you view this or how you understand it.
How the scientists do,
atmosphere is heating up because of the carbon dioxide we're pumping into it. What are the chain reactions
No, that's not. No, the atmosphere is warming up because the sun's rays are coming in, right? And on average, there is more being retained in the sense that the global temperature is creeping up on as it has been measured as reliably as it can as a kind of average temperature. Now, you don't just stick a probe into the Earth and go, it's 7 degrees. It's a calculation. But of course, you missed the main point. The main thing which keeps the main global warming element in the atmosphere is water. So 90% of the warming created by, the greenhouse Earth, isn't by the greenhouse gas CO2, it is by the greenhouse gas H2O, right? H2O has a much more impressive ability to allow the ultraviolets, and the infrareds to go through it and then reflect it back down once it's bounced back off the Earth, right? So if you really want it to stop and cool down the Earth very quickly, we would take all the moisture out of the Earth, stop all the clouds forming, right? But of course, we don't want to do that. That would obviously be stupid. And we don't want to take all the CO2 out of the atmosphere because, of course, the plants wouldn't have any food. So we know we need a good amount of CO2, right? And there is a good amount of CO2 that's been circulated by the plants. Now, every year, humans add to that amount of CO2 that's been released by the sea, released by the soils, released by the animals, released by the plants, taken in by the sea, taken in by the plants, etc., right? Onto this, humans take out an amount of CO2 from fossil fuels, obviously, and that is being added to, but it is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. And so there's been this argument, is there any strong evidence that this anthropomorphically added CO2 to the annual cycle of CO2 in the atmosphere is the primary cause of global warming? And it seems to be no. Right? There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of lot of people.
I'm very confused by where you're getting your information because it's definitely the opposite of what you're saying. The mere fact that we're taking
science. Luckily, science is not a consensus. Science is science.
Where are you getting the science?
Right. Do you think it's false that H2O is not the biggest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere?
No.
Yeah. Do you accept that? You don't think clouds and water in the atmosphere have a bigger impact on average global temperatures than CO2.
No. You do understand what
And you just don't
clouds?
know your
Okay.
science, bro.
All right. So
So
let's
think we'll probably have to.
let's just jump on something, right? The idea that you think that clouds and like moisture in the air is bad is very, very wrong.